Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us for today's graphical scaling webinar. We're going to begin now, but before I get started, just some quick logistics and things to talk about. If you haven't attended one of our webinars before, I can't hear you on this type of webinar. So if you have any questions or comments, put those into the chat panel or the Q&A panel on the WebEx interface. I'll try to get to those during the presentation. If not, there is a Q&A section at the end. Also, we will be recording this webinar, and either this one or the morning webinar will go up on the website. Usually takes a couple of days, does not happen right away. The recordings get posted usually in 2 or 3 days, and the slide deck as well. And we follow that up with a survey. Let us know how we did today. Let us know how we're doing in general. There's also a place for you to put your T-shirt size. If you give that to us, we'll send you a free T-shirt just for joining us. Show you our appreciation, and let's see what else. Also on that survey is a place if you're interested in co-hosting a webinar with us. Really love to have you on. If you have an interesting topic that you think others would like to see, let us know. And I think that's it for logistics. If not, I'll bring it up during the presentation. So let's go ahead and get started here. And today I'm going to cover a lot of different things. Again, this is about graphical scaling in InduSoft Web Studio. We're going to talk about some reasons to scale. Why would you want to? Understanding aspect ratio, project versus screen resolution, auto screen scaling, converting your resolution, manually changing screen attributes, using the open function, spanning multiple screens, and scaling your virtual keypad as well as other dialog boxes. So that's the agenda for today. My name is Scott Courtier. I'll be your host today. I'm Senior Technical Sales with InduSoft. And before we get started, I would love to mention that aware of this, we've won numerous awards from Control Engineering Magazine. It's that time again. We've reached finalist status for next year's award. And if you're not a subscriber of Control Engineering Magazine, sign up and vote for us. You can vote immediately after signing up. If you are a subscriber, you can vote for us here, or also if you go to the InduSoft homepage, you're going to find a nice little button right there on the InduSoft.com homepage where you can vote for us. So really appreciate that. If you would do that. This is not voted on by advertising dollars. This is voted on by readership, so every vote counts. And if you're interested, we'd appreciate you voting for us. Thanks. Okay, so why would you want to scale a screen or your graphics, your HMI, your Andon, your project within InduSoft Web Studio? Well, here's several reasons. There's many more, but here's some things that I could think of. If you're a machine builder, you can offer a standard resolution or standard size screen, let's say, a low-end and a high-end offering. So let's say your standard screen on your machine was 12-inch touch screen and had a particular resolution, maybe 800 by 600, and then you wanted to offer a low-end, maybe a 640 by 480 7-inch display, and a high-end, maybe a 15 or a 19-inch 1024 by 768 or even higher. The neat thing is you don't have to change the project, especially if they're the same aspect ratio. It's very easy to just check a checkbox and have those screens auto scale. Another opportunity would be obsolete or failing hardware. Maybe you've got an older PC that has failed or is obsolete and you want to upgrade something faster, more modern. Well, maybe that particular screen resolution wasn't developed or wasn't available back then, and now you have to move to a different aspect ratio. That might be a reason. Large production monitoring screens, or maybe an Andon, also known as Andon. This is an opportunity where you might have a big screen TV or an industrial type monitor hanging up in the rafters or mounted on the wall in a production area. Or even in a control room or an office environment, displaying dashboards, something like that, where maybe you've got an HMI on the machine that's, let's say, for example, 1024 by 768, but it's simultaneously driving production dashboard up on the wall or the rafters of your production environment that's 1920 by 1080. Maybe a big screen TV is up there. This webinar is going to show you a little bit about how to handle that, how to do that. A video wall, maybe in a control room where you might have a 2x2 or a 4x4 matrix of screens, or a 1x2 where you have two monitors side by side. We'll talk about that as well. I happen to run, my standard desktop is two monitors side by side. You guys get to see the left one and my right one. I've got other things open that I'm going to use during today's presentation. So that's the typical way that I run, and if I wanted to, I could use InduSoft Web Studio to span both of those screens. Mobile viewing, for example, on tablets or phones. Some tablets and phones have higher resolution than a lot of desktop monitors do these days, and to understand the scaling and how that works is something that we're also going to cover. So again, if you have questions or comments, put them into the chat panel or the Q&A panel. I appreciate that. So understanding aspect ratio. Understand that the aspect ratio is essentially the width to the height ratio. Believe it or not, I've had quite a few people that didn't really understand this and didn't quite get the correlation between the two. So a lot of times you'll hear 4:3. Well, that's an aspect ratio that essentially when you do the division, it's a 1.33 aspect ratio, also known as 4:3, or kind of the old time. It's been around for a while. Many of the resolutions in that aspect ratio are quarter VGA, 320 by 240, 640 by 480, 800 by 600, 1024 by 768, which is surprisingly still popular in many of the industrial touchscreens that are out there. The 4:3 aspect ratio has a pretty good fit on a lot of machinery, and it's taken a while to adopt to the widescreen, but it is coming. That widescreen, often known as 16 by 9, covers these aspect ratios, or these resolutions, I should say. 1920 by 1080, you're going to find a lot of TVs that a few years ago were advertised as high def, as 1080p. Well, that gets its number from this vertical resolution here. So 1080p monitors, TVs are typically 1920 by 1080. You're going to see that my laptop monitor is also 1920 by 1080, and if you go up to kind of 4 times that, or what's now the 4K resolution, is 3840 by 2160. Now, where does this come from? Basically, you take these numbers and do the division, and these aspect ratios fall out from basically being the lowest common denominator of that same equation. So that gives you, again, your kind of aspect ratio here. There are quite a few others. I have a slide that I call resources coming up in 2 or 3 slides, and I'm going to talk about other aspect ratios. These are kind of the most common ones that I've seen, out in the real world, but there are many, many, many others. And here's a good example. I grabbed this from Wikipedia. Here's the source of where this file came from, and this shows you kind of all the different display resolutions that are common. I know for a fact that there's many, many, many more than just this. I found this diagram, probably 10 or 15 years ago, when I used to work for an industrial PC manufacturer, and I could never keep these acronyms or these names straight as to what these displays were. For example, if it was quarter VGA or QVGA, it's 320 by 240. SVGA, XGA, WXGA, I couldn't keep all these things straight. So found this document. I've kind of paid attention to it for a while. But what I want you to look at here is everything in this case that's in the red is a 4:3 aspect ratio. And I think predominantly on this chart, And this does not take quantities into play here. It's merely just the individual sizes. But you can see that 4x3 is a pretty common display size. And next, the blue here is the 16:9, or the typically what's called widescreen. The widescreen kind of fits in anything up in this range. Really common again is the 1920x1080, and if you've done any Black Friday, Christmas shopping, at least in the U.S. or North America, you're going to find that UHD, or the 4K resolutions for TVs, are pretty popular. I don't know about the rest of the world. I know there's some different video standards, but these are getting really pushed. Now, I do want to bring up that it's fairly easy to get InduSoft Web Studio to display on a 1920x1080, or even a 4K resolution, or even larger. And I'm going to show you a little bit about how to do that. So this is the resources slide that I was talking about, and this is the one of the websites that we found. And this, hopefully this will open up off screen here. I'll bring this in. Now, this is a website that we found that, based on this particular website's browser share, when people go to different links that are using this counter, it keeps track of the screen resolutions. Now, I'm not quite sure where 640x360 comes in. Maybe that's a particular type of device, but you're going to see here that 1366x768, 1024x768, and 1920x1080 are extremely popular resolutions, and probably even more so in industrial flat panels, industrial touchscreens, used on machines or industrial environments, and 1920x1080 are fairly popular, maybe even in control rooms, or maybe even 4K screens at this point. So pay attention to that. There is a blog article that we have that we wrote in 2011. It's how to choose the best resolution for a project, and I'll simplify that here. That is, how do you choose your project resolution? Well, first of all, what you really should be choosing is the resolution, the native resolution of your runtime computer. Where are you going to run this? Is this going to be on an industrial touchscreen? Is this going to be a high-def monitor hanging up in the rafters, video wall in the control room? But if you know the native resolution of the runtime, that's what you should choose. If you don't know that, then choose the aspect ratio. For example, if you're going to purchase a touchscreen from a particular supplier, maybe an industrial HMI or industrial IPC, I should say, and they only have a 4:3 aspect ratio, or their newer computers with the right processors that you want are only widescreen, well, then you should probably choose a widescreen aspect ratio, maybe a resolution that's 16:9, if that's the aspect ratio that that your particular vendor has. Then, if you don't know any of those, then maybe try to choose popular sizes, maybe from the website that I just joined, or asking around what are some popular sizes on maybe previous equipment, things of that nature, if you need to get started with your development before you have purchased the actual equipment. So those are some things. That's in detail in this blog post that we have here. Another blog post that we've done just a few years ago is aspect ratios within InduSoft Web Studio. I'm going to try to call this one up and see if this one launches. I had some problems this morning, and I forgot to clean up those links. So let's see. Try this again here, see if this works. And yes, it did. So there is a nice blog article. It's fairly long, talks about the viewer settings, talks about the little bars that you get. I'm going to cover that, scaling of the resolution. So it's a really good blog post on aspect ratios. And then we also have a multi-monitor sample and a tech note that goes along with that. So if you, again, go back to our web page, our home page here, let me pull this up, and go to sample applications. If you didn't know, we've got a lot of different sample applications up on the website. I think these are on this one's on the second page here. This is a multi-monitor project. Now, this is a project that you can download, and this goes hand in hand with a tech note. You can get to it via this link here using multiple monitors, or you can go up to our documentation tech notes, and you'll find right here using multiple monitors with InduSoft Web Studio. Now, I'm going to open this up and show you a little bit about this, and then kind of tuck it away and pull it out again later. This is, scroll this down a little bit here, pretty involved. It's 24 pages long. It's got a lot of nice things in here. It talks about some actual reasons why these things work, and then some code, actually how to do this. And if I scroll down here, you should see shortly some actual code in here and where to put it and how to do all this. So again, I'm going to bring this up in a little bit. I'll move that off screen and move this browser window off screen. So some good resources to fall back on if you're interested. And for those of you who are new to our webinar series, we've been doing this for quite a few years, 3 or 4 years anyway, and I think we're over 150, maybe approaching 160 recordings. So we cover a lot of topics, and we've got a lot of different resources up on the website for you to take a look at. Okay, project resolution versus screen resolution. When you first create a new project, you have a drop-down list where you can choose your project resolution. And if you've ever seen this list, there's a lot of different display sizes here. You know, InduSoft Web Studio has been around for 20 years now. And when we first started out, we started to try to keep up with the display manufacturers. But if you saw that graphic that I had up earlier, you really understand that screen resolution, screen sizes kind of got out of control. And so we didn't have to keep up. Every version come out with a new display size. We added this top choice here called custom. And when you do that, you get these two fields that you can put numbers in between 240 and 10,000. So you can have small resolution by as 240 by 240 and as large as 10,000 by 10,000. And so that essentially covers 45 high-def 1080p monitors if you so choose. If you can find that hardware that's going to drive that, let me know. I'd love to see that. The largest I've ever seen has been 8 70-inch monitors tied together. It was huge, and it just made for an incredible display that you could see literally hundreds of meters away, very, very far distance in an industrial environment. Something to note is that once you choose that project resolution, you can view it, but you can't actually change it in our graphical user interface. In our development environment, you cannot change that. There are ways to have it change, for example, using the Convert Resolution tool, but a lot of people look for a place that they can just go type in the project resolution. It unfortunately isn't there. We have talked about adding it, and it may come, but it's not coming anytime soon. But typically, you don't need that. When you start a new screen, it references that project resolution and then starts your screen with that display size, which you can then manually go change if you need to, either width or height or even location. I'm going to do a little bit of that here in a few minutes. I had really never put it this way before. I talked to Fabio Terrazino, essentially our product manager, our P&L leader, and was getting some notes and some ideas because, quite frankly, I've been using InduSoft for close to 20 years, and there were just some things that I didn't quite understand. And he put it to me this way. If you create a project, and I'm going to just simplify things, and let's say it's 5 by 5 and not an actual resolution, but notice this is square. So this is an example. If I started my project and I created my project as a resolution of 5 by 5, and I have a screen resolution that's 5 by 5, and the container that it goes into. Now, whether that is your computer monitor, and that's the resolution of the monitor, or whether that's a browser window if you're using an SMA client, it's important to understand the differences between these three: the project resolution, the screen resolution, and the container resolution. So as you can imagine, if you start a project that's 5 by 5 and you create a screen that's 5 by 5 and the container is 5 by 5, well, guess what? It's going to show as, native 5 by 5. Now we're going to talk a bit about auto screen scaling. Now, what does auto screen scaling do, and where can you find it? Well, first of all, it's found in the project viewer under the project viewer. And if I go create, let me go create a new project here. So let's go to here, and we'll create a new project. And what did I click on here? We'll create a project called Graphic Scaling Afternoon. And I'll just make it local interface here. Now, what I'm going to do for this project, so I can give you some examples, is I'm not going to choose my monitor resolution, which is 1920 by 1080. Remember I said you should choose where you're going to run this, the runtime computer's resolution. So maybe pretty common, 1024 by 768. I'll choose that. Say OK. And what this will do is create my project resolution in 1024 by 768. If I wanted to verify that, I'll go to Project Options here, and it will show this resolution is 1024 by 768. I've had a few people, different training classes, ask, hey, I want to go in here and type and change this, but it won't let me. How do I change that? As I mentioned, there is no way to change the project resolution in the graphical user interface of InduSoft Web Studio. So this is not where you do it, and you're not going to get to it anywhere in here. If you do the convert resolution, it will change it for you. We'll cover that in a few slides. So I've made my project 1024 by 768, and what it will do when I insert a screen, it will reference that and make that the default size of a new screen that I create. And if you've ever taken our training class or looked at our training videos online, where we'll often have a header screen that's maybe 100 pixels tall, navigation that's 100 or 150 pixels wide down the left side, and then kind of the main workspace area that takes up the rest of that resolution, we often build those three screens and change the size and the location in these three different fields here. I'm going to actually get to that in a minute. But until then, I'm going to make a screen that's full screen here. And so I've closed my database SPI and my output window, so you can see that this aspect ratio of this is a 4 by 3 aspect ratio. It's 1024 by 768. And as a test or an example, what I'm going to do is I'm going to put some rectangles in here, and I'm going to make these 100 by 100 pixels, so they're squares. And I'm going to tuck these in the upper left-hand corner. Oops, I keep bumping into the edge there. I'm going to tuck these into the corners here, and I'm going to copy this just by holding down my Control key. And in order to get one in this very corner here, I'm actually snapping to the grid. So what I'm going to do is right-click and turn off the grid snap to setting so I can tuck that further in the corner so I can see the actual boundaries of where this screen lies. I'm going to save this. And we'll just save this as main. And then something I always forget to do is make this my startup screen. And now, when we run this project, what you're going to see is the screen in a 1024 by 768 size here. Here's the 4 squares that I put in there so you know where the boundaries of that screen are. But this is running on a 1920 by 1080 monitor. My display monitor that I'm showing you here is 1920 by 1080. That's what this extra space is here. And just like if you were viewing a standard definition TV program on a high-def TV, you'd have bars typically on the sides, or some TVs allow you to adjust that a little bit. What you're seeing here, this gray background, is actually what we call the viewer. It's kind of, you can kind of think of it as the canvas that we paint all of the screens on. It's actually a separate process in InduSoft Web Studio. It's viewer.exe. And so that's kind of what you're seeing here in the background. More on that later. So the slide that I was on is we're talking about auto screen scaling. And if you look here under Project Viewer, there's a checkbox for auto screen scaling. So back to my development environment, if I go to Project Viewer, auto screen scaling, and just check that checkbox, this will affect your local viewer and your secure viewer thin clients. This will not affect web thin clients or SMA thin clients, but it will affect the local viewer and secure viewer clients. So just by making that checkbox checked, let's talk about, before I do this, what's going to happen. It's essentially going to drag this corner down at a 45-degree angle, keeping the aspect ratio, but enlarging this. It could enlarge or shrink if you were going the opposite way as well, but it will keep the aspect ratio until it bumps into either the bottom or the right side of the screen. Now in this case, I'm taking a 4:3 aspect ratio and showing it on a widescreen or a 16:9, and so it's going to run into the bottom before it runs into the side. Now, if you had a 16:9 that you were showing on a 4:3, it would run into the side before it ran into the bottom. But what we should see is this all the way full to the bottom with a gray bar left on the right-hand side. So when we run this with this checkbox checked, you'll see this has gotten as big as it can get by going all the way to the bottom of the screen. Hopefully that's coming through on the WebEx, and you get this gray bar here on the side. So that's what that checkbox does. Many of you will have found that. Some of you may have not. We often get questions about that. How do I do this? There are different checkboxes for the web thin client. If you're using the web thin client, you can find those settings here under the Project Web Settings. This is the auto screen scaling for the web thin client. And then a little bit different place for the mobile access, Studio Mobile Access. If you come in here under Thin Clients and open that up, here under Global Settings, there's a choice here for Disable Auto Screen Scaling or how you're going to handle the zooming, and there's some different settings in here on how that's handled on the SMA clients, on what you want to happen there. So take a look at those settings and see how those actually covered that in the web thin client, the SMA client webinar that we did fairly recently, I believe. So this will cover SMA thin clients as well. So, okay, now back to this concept of the project, the screen, and the container resolution. With auto screen scaling off, what I did a minute ago when I saw all that gray space was I took the screen that I had created, or the project resolution and my screen resolution, they were the same. And with auto scale turned off, it was essentially showing the screen at its native resolution. And with auto screen off, it doesn't even have to, it does not look at the project resolution. Basically, it just says we're going to make this screen this much resolution regardless of how much space is there. When I checked the checkbox, here's what happened. It took the screen resolution, referenced the project resolution, and took a look at the container resolution and said, hey, we've got to scale this thing up. So in this case, where it's the same aspect ratio, you can see how it enlarged the objects on the screen, kept the same aspect ratio. It did not make squares rectangles. It did not make circles into ovals or rugby balls or American footballs. And it kept that aspect resolution. So again, the project resolution, other than when you create a new screen, it's really only used and referenced when you're doing auto screen scaling. Otherwise, it doesn't really take place need in the project development. Convert resolution. What I'm going to do is I'm going to skip ahead a slide. I'm going to come back. Manual change of screen attributes. When would you change the screen size and location? Essentially, this changes the screen dimensions, kind of the the background of the screen, the allowable area of that screen is what it changes. And many of you will see this, as I mentioned before, in our training classes when we do the header, the navigation, and kind of the main area, and we tie that all together to make a screen group, which I'm about ready to do. You could also use this to alter an individual screen or some screens for use on a particular device. Now, what do I mean by that? Let's say you've got an HMI on a machine that's 1024 by 768, but you also want to drive a remote big screen TV with a 1920 by 1080 aspect ratio. Well, you might not ever want to show that screen on your HMI, but have that available as 1920 by 1080. So you go in and edit that size and width and save that screen, and maybe not make that the navigation so that you can't get to that screen from your HMI, but on your big screen TV, whatever's driving that, either secure viewer or an SMA client, maybe that's the startup screen and shows on there. So maybe that's a screen that only shows on different resolution. Or if you're going to size and position screens or screen sets, maybe you develop a whole set of screens in your application that are specifically for phones or tablets, and you need to make that as full screen as possible, as well as the scaling of those. As I mentioned before, that setting will allow you to do pinch and zoom and kind of adjust for that. There's also another thing that I'm going to demonstrate here is size or position a screen to fill the area that's left over by auto screen scaling. So here's a concept. When we're running, and I think I'm still running in the background here, I've done that auto screen scaling, and now I've got this extra space. What do I do with it? There are several options. I could edit this screen and tell it to expand here. That may not be good. It would leave my objects alone, but wouldn't alter those resolution or aspect ratio. One of the things that we've suggested to quite a few customers, and they've kind of liked, is if you're going to run this project and maybe it's on different hardware, different resolution screens, where sometimes it's on 4:3 and sometimes it's on 16:9, well, you can optionally put another screen in this space. So for example, and I've done a little bit of the math ahead of time, if you remember when we put this screen up the first time, and I'm going to right click and go to screen attributes here, we developed it as 1024 wide. Well, that got scaled and it enlarged that a little bit, and without doing the math, I don't necessarily know where that edge is, but since it's auto scaled, I know that this project thinks that it ends at 1024. So if I make a new screen here, if I insert a new screen and I tell it to start the first pixel that it starts with in the X direction is 1024, it'll start over that many pixels from where the other one ended, or right where the other one ended, I should say. And now I need to know the width of that leftover space. Well, mathematically you can calculate it. I did some tests and made sure this morning that I knew what I was doing, and that width is 343. So if I make it 343, that's that leftover space. I'll have a screen that's just that extra little space there. And if I make this screen here, I need to put something on this screen. So why don't I go back and do those 100 pixel squares up in the corners, just so we get an idea. And I'm going to put 3 of these in the corner because I don't really need the bottom left one. Screen attributes, sorry. Grid settings, I need to make sure my grid's turned off there. I'll put these in these corners here, and I'll save this as test. Now, to get all of these 2 screens to start up at the same time, many of you will know that this needs to be a screen group. I'm going to insert a screen group called Startup and make these 2 screens part of my startup. and then switch this from the main screen starting up to my group. So let's expand this, set as startup. And now when I run this, I've kept that screen white to show you a concept. This is where these screens end and continue. And notice that I've kind of expanded the way that this screen looks, and it's two separate screens, but they seamlessly kind of coexist. Now this extra space over here, let me go ahead and color that screen background. I'm going to right click, go to background color, and just pick green here and say yeah, save. And when I run this, now it'll be a little bit more apparent where that screen ends. You could leave it as a white background as I did a minute ago to just make the screen look like it's a little bit bigger and not have that gray space over there. You could put another suggestion that we've come up with, and I think this is the last item on this slide, is to fill in that area left over by the auto screen scale. You could put optional stuff that might not be super important for your project. Maybe you have a list of users, maybe alarms, maybe events. Again, maybe something that's not critical to your application. If you run this on a widescreen monitor, then that stuff shows up. If you run it on a 4:3 aspect ratio, then this whole section does not show up, but it doesn't break the application either. So that's an opportunity there. So I had skipped over a slide. Let me go back up. Now let's talk about this convert resolution. This is suggested to use when you want to change the aspect ratio of your project. I'm actually going to change this project from 1024 by 768 to 1920 by 1080. Notice that anytime you use this, you may need some additional manual cleanup on the screens. It's not uncommon. There's also a checkbox to keep original aspect ratio for each object. That's down here. And what that'll do is that will resize the objects according to the change in aspect ratio here. It's going to keep the aspect ratio for the objects. For example, these squares are not going to become rectangles. They're going to stay squares. But it will change the spacing. And again, sometimes you'll need some manual cleanup. It gets pretty close. It's pretty good. But anytime you're going from one aspect ratio to another aspect ratio, there's there's just different amount of pixels, and we can't guess exactly what you want to do. It'd be great if we could, but you may need a little bit of additional cleanup on there. So let's see how this works. Let's go. I'm going to stop this project. I'm going to turn off my auto screen scaling. I'm going to go back to make just my main screen as the startup and not that whole screen group. And then what I'm going to do is convert resolution here from 1024 by 768 to 1920 by 1080. Before I do that, I just want to remind you again, here's the resolution of my project. And I can't change it here. But if I say OK and come back here under the Home tab and do a convert resolution from 1024 by 768 to 1920 by 1080, and I keep the aspect ratio for the objects, I'll say convert. And now this converts all of the screens in my entire project, not just the ones that were 1024 by 768. This converts essentially the project. So screens that were not 1024 by 768, it figures out the ratio, does the math between these, and converts those screens accordingly. So what I'm left with is, if I go into this main screen now, it's no longer 1024 by 768. If I right-click and go to my screen attributes, it's now the 1920 by 1080. But you'll also see that my squares have been converted to 141 pixels by 140. Notice that they are still squares, and this screen, there's a little bit of spacing that needs to be cleaned up. If I wanted to, I could just kind of move those manually, and these squares down here, down in the bottom. So I have my auto screen scaling turned off, and now if I run this project, which I think I did this before, just to make sure, I'll make just the main screen my startup screen. Here on my 1920 by 1080, monitor, this screen is now full screen. So that's, if you want to change the aspect ratio, how you do it. You don't necessarily go in here and try to figure out how to type this in, because you're not going to find that. That's what the convert resolution does. So hopefully that explains that. Some of those things have always baffled me, or for quite a few years. If you for whatever reason have to change the aspect ratio of your project, here are some suggestions, and these do not fit everybody's application, but some things to try. The change the resolution of the monitor. Well, this really depends on your graphics card. Let me go into my Windows desktop here, right-click on the desktop, and change screen resolution. So here you're going to see that I have two monitors side by side. They're 1920 by 1080. You could change this resolution to another resolution if you needed to, either scaling up or scaling down. This particular monitor with my laptop supports a maximum of 1920 by 1080. This monitor over here, I can actually go up to 4K. I have a 4K monitor here. You can see that I can change this to not necessarily only 16 by 9, but other aspect ratios in between here. So lots of opportunities there. Also notice that here is this screen happens to be my main display. This screen, in this dialog box, gives me the opportunity to make it my main display. That's going to come up in a slide coming up here. So you could change the resolution of your monitor. And in this morning's webinar, one of the questions or comments that came up was we had a customer. This is what they do. They change the resolution of their monitor before changing anything with the resolution in the actual project. They said that works great for what they have to do. Depends on the graphics card that your PC has, on whether it will scale up or scale down. Depends on the monitor that you have, and also the quality of the display. Is it going to anti-alias the fonts? Are they going to look a little fuzzy or not? And that's up to you to give that a try. The next suggestion, these are kind of in the order of how we would suggest to use the auto screen scale. It's going to fill in, but you're going to have one of those bars either on the side, as I did here, or on the bottom. And you can, as I just showed a minute ago, optionally fill that section in with optional screen or objects or multiple screens even. You could modularize that any way you wanted to, and even have multiple screens in that space. Then convert resolution might be the next way to go, or hate to say it, redevelop your screens. You can copy and paste from one project to another. I have done this when I would also highly suggest that you make a backup of your project before you do any of this. In fact, this is so important. I'm glad I thought of this. What I'm going to do is go back in and add this on this slide as step number 1, make backup. And the reason I say this is I have really messed up some projects. You should always make backups. Somebody very wise once told me there's two kinds of people when making backups, those who do it and those who will do it. I always thought that was kind of funny, but it struck a chord with me after having lost things. The other time I really stress making a backup of your project is when you're adding security to a project. I've locked myself out of my own project before. This is just kind of a note, but where was I going? Oh, you can copy and paste from one project. Let's say copy, close the project, open a new project, and then paste. Another opportunity that you have, it's going to take me a minute to show, is, for example, let me go into the development environment here. So this is my main screen in my graphic scaling afternoon project. I don't know if many of you know this, but you can actually open screens from another project simultaneously. So I can go here I can say open a project file. Now I don't necessarily want to point it to this, but this is if I'm copying screens from another project or copying objects from another project. I could say here, I want to open up my InduSoft projects. I did one today that was a test. I can go here under screens and notice there's screen files, .scc, different documents, even scripting you can open up if you wanted to grab scripting from another document. I'm going to grab screen files, and let's say I have another screen called test that I did in this morning's webinar. This is not this test. This one is from that other presentation or the test that I did this morning when I was trying all this out. And then I can right-click on this tab, and then I could take objects from this screen, which is in a different project, copy them and paste them into this project. You can do the same thing again with scripting or just about any document within InduSoft Web Studio. So that's a real handy tool to be able to copy and paste from one project to another. But sometimes that's the only thing that you can get away with, or the best way to do that. Let me put this back into view mode here. If you didn't know, so that's a lot, mostly what I wanted to cover with the resolution. I want to talk about some things that change size within InduSoft Web Studio. The open function supports optional screen coordinates, and they could be different than the original size of the screen. These parameters, so when you use the open, this is a copy and a paste right out of the help system. You give it the screen name and optionally properties, and then the X and Y of the upper corner, and then the X and Y of the lower corner. And let me give you an example with a pop-up dialog box here. So on this main screen, if I was to create a button, and we'll call this, we'll label this pop-up, no scale, and I'll have this open up a screen that I have not yet created. And if you've ever seen my training class, I don't recommend doing what I'm about to do, but I'm going to tell it to use the open screen type. This is one of the simplest ways to open a screen. And here's the part that I don't like to do. I'm going to type in the name of a screen that I have not yet created. So I'm going to call that pop-up. And the reason is I could better even change the name completely, and it wouldn't work. So I usually recommend saving the screen first. But I know I'm going to call this pop-up. And so what I'm going to do now is create a screen here, insert a screen, and it's, instead of the replace partial or replace complete, I'm going to make this a pop-up style. I'm going to give it a border and a title bar, and so I don't have to put a close button on there. And I'm going to make this be 100 pixels by 100 pixels, and I want it to start 400 pixels from the top and 400 pixels over. And so it's going to be 100 pixels by 100 pixels, and then 400 over, 400 down, pop-up type, and that's what it's going to look like. There's not much on it, but at least I have a close button on there. And shoot, I didn't put anything on there, so it didn't let me save it. I know better than that. Let's go back and do that again. My apologies. And 400 by 400, and say OK. And I want a thin pop-up with a title bar, and just so we have something on there, I'll put a kind of a fake button on here. Let's see. Why is it not letting me? There we go. And there's our button. Now, normally I put a close on there, but since there's a close on this, that'll work. And I'll call this pop-up. And so now when we run this, let's see, I think I can just hit run here. And I press this over 400 pixels, down 400 pixels, 100 pixels by 100 pixels, showed this pop-up screen. This, because I've not chose resizing, it doesn't allow me to resize this, but I can reposition it based on those attributes that I set, and I can close this. Now, let's take this another step further. Rather than using this command animation, which is the open screen, what I'm going to do is copy this button, and using my control key, I'll drag down a copy. I'm going to change the text and say change size. Boy, if I could spell today. And instead of doing the open screen command, I could choose either the built-in scripting language and put the open function in here. What I'm actually going to do is use the VB script interface. And to do that, anytime I use an InduSoft built-in script inside the VB script interface, I have to precede it with a $sign. And then if I just start typing open, you can see that the IntelliSense has found that function. I can hit enter, and then open parenthesis, and there's my parameters that are also in the help. So you can see the first parameter is the screen name and any properties, and then my coordinates here. So what I'm going to do is, because that's a string, I'm going to call this pop-up, and this could be a string tag if you wanted it to be, comma. And with this one, we had it over 400 pixels and down 400 pixels. Let's make this one appear someplace else. Let's do this one at 200 pixels by 200. And then we have to talk about the bottom corner of this. So what I want to define now is the bottom corner of where that pop-up window will be, not on this button, but actually on the pop-up window. So let's say that we make this thing 100 pixels wide. So 200 plus 100 is 300, and then maybe we make this thing 500 pixels tall. So 200, 700 will make that thing 500 pixels tall. That's all of the parameters that I need in there. And say yes. So now when I run this, here is the first instance of that. I call that pop-up, and it appears this is 400 over 400 down. If I close that here, it appears at 200 and 200, and notice that I've changed the size of that. So many people don't realize that you've got those optional parameters in there. And there's even some additional parameters when it comes to the open command that I see a lot of people want, but they don't know how to take and make use of. So let me go here into the help and show you the parameters in the open command because these are pretty nice. These we just played with these parameters here. This one here, mnemonics list. Very simple, or very similar to our symbol syntax. If you wanted to pass in a list of parameters, let's say you have one screen that's a pop-up that's a pump faceplate. You could call that up multiple times, have multiple instances of that same screen, but pass it a list of variables for pump 1, pump 2, pump 27, and not have to make 27 different screens. You can make one and pass it a list of variables and an instance ID number. So then you can use the close function to close that instance number. If you've got 5 of those open, pick which one you want to close. So there's some really nice descriptions down here on how you handle that. You can even pass that list from a text file as well. Now we've got a couple of webinars that we've done this on, covered this topic, but I wanted to point that out. That's a feature that a lot of people ask for, but didn't know we already have built into the product. Okay, so let's see. So again, useful for pop-up and dialog boxes as well. So multiple screens, spanning multiple screens. If you didn't know, so back when I mentioned a few minutes ago on that resolution, screen resolution when you change on your computer, the main display is important to understand. When you run InduSoft Web Studio, the viewer shows up on your main screen and only your main screen, even if you've got your computer set to span or do what's called an extended desktop. Like I have here, I have stuff off of the screen. For example, if I have a notepad open here, I'm viewing that on my other screen, and I could pull that into screen here. Even though that extends my desktop, the viewer only starts on the main screen. If you want to expand the viewer space, you can use this set viewer position function. And similar to the open screen, similar but not exact, you pass it this starting point, the left and the top position, X and Y coordinate, and then you actually pass it the width and the height. You don't pass it this bottom corner like in the open command. It's actually the width and the height. Then that sets up the space where the viewer is. And you don't execute this in the startup script. The first time I tried this, I put it in the startup script. It didn't work, and then found out, well, when your project is starting, the order of operations is that your startup script actually runs before the graphics have started. So you need to put this set viewer position in your graphics script on start, and when your graphics run, then you can set this viewer position and span multiple monitors. Now, I've used this for years. I've been able to use this set viewer position and navigate if I have one screen that I want to appear here, or using that open command, I can make it appear over here by choosing this starting point here. Or I can have screens that span the whole 3840 by 1920 if I wanted to. But another way to do this, kind of a little bit more work up front, but a lot more powerful and a lot more flexible, is by starting another viewer on the second or third or fourth monitor. You can do this. Here's some examples. Basically, you would use the WinExec function, which basically for us launches any executable, Windows executable. You could use that in a background script, but then on what it does is it actually launches another instance of the runtime, or another viewer.exe. And as I mentioned up here, you would put that in the on start of the graphics script, and then use the set viewer position and have a separate instance of the viewer running. Now you can do this many, many, many times. Literally, it could be 10, 5, 10, 15, 20, could be possibly even hundreds of those open simultaneously if you've got, again, the monitors that will support it. So that's another way to do this. Now, I mentioned that multi-screen sample application and tech note. I'm going to bring that back into play because this is exactly what this is talking about. This is talking about using WinExec and opening another viewer, and then how you span the screens and do the set viewer position. So this tech note gives you all the examples of how to span multiple screens and how to handle that. So very technical, very detailed tech note. So I highly encourage you, if you have to do something like that, take a look at that tech note. The last thing that I want to bring up, one more quick thing, is pop-up keyboard scaling. If you guys didn't know this, we get this question a lot on how to handle scaling of the virtual keyboard. I also want to bring up, if I didn't bring up this before, is that this webinar came out of questions from users asking us to do a screen scaling webinar. So we listened to you guys, and that's why we're doing this one. So let us know in the survey if you'd like to see any other topics. So what I'm going to do here is put a text display. I'm just going to say test and put some hash marks in here, tie it to a text data link, use input enabled, and notice my virtual keyboard is not enabled. I cannot click on this and do anything with this. I need to go into my project viewer settings and enable my virtual keyboard. That will allow that virtual keyboard to then pop up. And depending on how you've scaled your displays or what resolutions you have, this might be too small for your fingers or gloves or whatever. So to fix that, what you can do is go back into Viewer, and this built-in dialog scale, you can now set this at a percentage size, and it will be larger and or smaller. And you can actually set this to auto scale as well, and it will take into account your aspect ratio, and it'll do some math, and it'll try to kind of best fit that. So when you run this screen, you can see that this is taking on a little bit of a widescreen aspect ratio. It's kind of stretched it a little bit, but kind of best fit to your resolution, gets you a proportional size that kind of makes sense for you there. So again, it's now labeled as built-in dialogue scale because this affects more than the virtual keypad. It also affects some of the dialog boxes, such as your log on dialog box for security, and there's a couple other ones that it affects as well. So with that, about 1 minute over, about exactly an hour. Open it up for questions. If there's any questions, put those into the chat panel, the Q&A panel. Let me know. While we're doing that, if you need to get a hold of us, info@indusoft.com is a great way to get a hold of us. Really appreciate you joining us today. Don't forget to fill out that survey. This recording will go up on the website usually in a couple of days. And if there's anything else you'd like to let us know about additional webinars, additional content that you'd like to see for future webinars, we'd love to hear from you. Had some really good suggestions from the morning webinar for future webinars. Really appreciate that. A question came in. Do any of the objects work with scalar graphics? I think you mean vector graphics. Thanks for the question. Yeah, that's a good question. I was going to ask this before I started the webinar, and I forgot to. I'm not 100% sure, but what I have heard, so for example, some of the symbols and a lot of the objects that you can place on the screen, so for example, if I use the linked picture, these are non-scalable vector graphics. There's bitmaps, GIF files, JPEGs, PNG. Windows Meta files, EMF and WMF files, I believe, are scalable vector type graphics, but we don't support, for example, SVG graphics in this type. But what I have been told, but I haven't actually 100% convinced myself that it exists, when you publish these screens to HTML and you use them in an SMA client, so in an HTML5 web browser, it's actually converted those graphics into the HTML5 canvas, and there they are, SVG graphics. So I hope that answers your question, and I need to find out a little bit more of that. The person who asked that question, I know who you are. Thank you. Good talking to you. Thanks for the question. And if I find anything more about that, I'll get back with you. That's always stuck in my head as well. So I don't know enough about that. But are there any other questions? Again, put those into the chat panel or the Q&A panel. I don't see any other questions. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and end the webinar. Thank you so much for joining us. I hope this was beneficial, and let us know how we did today on that survey, and look for the video up on our website or any other videos. And with that, everybody have a great day, and this is the end of the webinar. Thanks.